Welcome to Session 2 of the MSU Resiliency Planning webinar series. My name is Tyler Augst, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm an educator with MSU Extension and the Michigan Sea Grant Program. I'll be serving as today's moderator for our program. Today's webinar is the second of 6 sessions in the MSU Extension Land Use Team's Thought Leader Series in partnership with the MSU School of Planning, Design, and Construction and the National SUGRET Institute at MSU. In today's session, we'll discuss what a resilient regional economy looks like, how disrupting events like climate change and the pandemic impact those regional economies, and what the work of building a regional economic resilience looks like. Allow me to introduce today's panel. Dr. Rex Lamore is the director of Michigan State University's Center for Community Economic Development and a member of the faculty of the Urban and Regional Planning Program. Dr. Lamore has over 40 years of experience in community and economic development and has focused his career on the unique challenges of revitalizing distressed communities and policies and practices related to promoting equitable and sustainable development. In addition to directing the center, Dr. Lamore's current research is focused on a variety of community and economic development areas, including circular economic theory and practice, and sustainability in community planning and development. Dr. Pele Fan is professor of urban and regional planning at the School of Planning, Design, and Construction here at Michigan State University. She also holds a joint research appointment at the Center for Global Change and Earth Observations as an adjunct faculty member of the Geography department. She has served as a consultant and economist for the United Nations University World Institute of Development Economics Research and the Asian Development Bank. Dr. Fan's research focuses on urban environment and sustainability, public health, innovation and economic development, and planning and policy. And Jeff Smith is an instructor of urban and regional planning in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction, and he is also the director of the University Corporate Research Park at the MSU Foundation. In his role at the Research Park, Jeff Smith manages and directs the real estate and economic development opportunities to include the Research Park and the Technology Innovation Center Business Incubator, as well as develop opportunities and resources for companies commercializing in university technologies into the marketplace. Take it away, Rex.
So I'd like to thank the MSU team for organizing the series, and a special shout out to Ms. Harmony Gamazzo, who's provided overall leadership for the development of this, I think, very relevant program. And also Mr. Augst, Tyler Augst, and Kelly Humes, who have been providing technical support and are hosting our conversation today. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Elma Gilbert, who for her support in developing the materials that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I chose this title purposely to draw our attention to what I think is an important characteristic that we should consider, that our post-COVID world could and should be different than the world that we are working with now. And it is likely to be different because there are going to be challenges for us in the future that we are currently not equipped to address. So there's been some fundamental changes, I think, that we might observe in our planning profession. In the past, we have primarily relied upon past trends to permit us to forecast future scenarios. And while that has been reasonable in the past, what we're likely to see in the future is we're likely to see events that we had not seen in the past that will be occurring. And often they're called what professional planners call black swans. And for the purpose of today, a black swan is an unpredictable, rare event of such a magnitude that it can change the course of history, and in retrospect is often seen as totally predictable. Black swans interrupt our capacity to predict the future. Clearly, our COVID experience is one such event. Entirely predictable, and certainly we had been warned by our public health officials to anticipate pandemics, but we were not prepared for it. And now we're paying the price for that being unprepared. I would suggest that in the future, we're likely to see more and more of these types of events occurring. On the left, you see a graph that identifies the number of natural disasters that have occurred globally over the past 100 years. And as you can see, this is a rising curve. So we are seeing more frequent natural disasters. I'd like to also draw your attention to the graphic on the right, a work by Kate Rayworth and her publication Donut Economics, which I encourage folks to look at, which looks at where we are seeing both social foundation challenges, the inner circle of the donut, where we are experiencing shortfalls, both in such things as social equity, housing, energy, water, food, for example, and on the outer part of the donut, where we are bumping into ecological parameters, ecological ceilings that will limit our capacity to continue the way we've been doing things in the past, such issues as loss of biodiversity, land conversion, and of course, climate change. So we're seeing a number of uncertainties that are confronting us that we had not observed in the past that we need to account for in the future. This brings us to the challenge of trying to understand how can we be more resilient in our planning and how can we help communities be more resilient in their responses to these unforeseen challenges. We recently hosted a forum at Michigan State University with a number of thinkers and doers from across the state who helped us articulate our understanding of what is resiliency in planning. And as you can see from this diagram, there's quite a bit of uncertainty about what do we mean by resilient. And so for the purposes of today's discussion, let me share with you what I think could be a good working definition. And a resilient regional economy is one that is able to help households, businesses, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. The characteristics of a resilient regional economy will be the ability to recover from some sort of an event, a shock, a black swan event, the capacity to learn from those events, to plan for and communicate about possible shocks, our ability to self-organize and to be self-reliant in times of crisis, and to build the strong connections that are so necessary for our effective response capacity when we are confronted with these kinds of challenges. So in beginning the process of understanding your resilient regional economy, one of the steps that you will need to consider is what is the geographic region that you're going to look at. The size of the region can be determined by a number of characteristics, including the economic relationships within the region, the transportation corridors that exist, such environmental parameters, for example, as watersheds or shorelines or other environmental characteristics that might create a regional identity. And one of the elements that you need to consider is, does the region have a social affinity? Does it think of itself as a place where people have a shared destiny whose futures are intertwined, and what happens to some others will affect me, and so that we're willing to work together to address that shared concern and shared destiny. Let me draw your attention to our Michigan Association of Regions as one set of organizations. These are multi-county organizations that are now being called upon by the federal government in response to COVID to help us develop resilient, comprehensive economic development strategies. This might be one place for those of you who are not currently involved in developing a resilient regional economy to participate in that process. You may see that list of regions by Googling the Michigan Association of Regions and identifying the geographic area that you're currently in that might line up with that region, and then ask them about their resilient, comprehensive development, economic development strategy, and participate in that where feasible. Secondly, let me note that in all the literature and what we've seen in everyday experience is that broad-based participation is critical in the development of a resilient regional economy. If not, the COVID pandemic has highlighted that many of our racial, social, and economic inequalities have certainly caused suffering and pain for others and for some of our communities. It has shown that these inequities weaken our community and our timeliness in response. And I would draw your attention to our experience where in Katrina, where large portions of the community were left out of the planning and preparation necessary to respond to a major disaster like a hurricane, and they were left in very untenable positions. So it's critical that we have broad participation in the planning of that regional resilient economy. And part of that is to build the trust amongst the participants in residents in our community and the participants in the planning process to build the consensus that is necessary to move forward. When we work to build trust, so when people are called to take action, folks understand why they are being called and what the actions are they are expected to take. So begin to build that trusting relationship across your community so that in the event of an event that occurs in your community, you're able to respond in a very timely and comprehensive fashion. Let me also suggest, as your third step in the process, you begin to think about starting with your basic needs. Starting with meeting your basic needs, I'm going to share with you some specific tools here in a minute that will help you identify your economic relationships that can be applied to your basic needs. But think about how you would help address the basic needs of food, of course, energy, shelter, security, water, access to healthcare. So look at your local region, your regional economy, and identify how these basic needs can be met in the time of crisis. Step 4, identifying the relationships at the regional level, the economic relationships. Understand your supply chains for your basic needs. Where are your inputs? Where are your outputs? Where is there vulnerability in your supply chain, such that you can maybe identify possible local substitution when necessary in a time of crisis to ensure that those basic needs are met. Building off of your assets, you're likely to be able to support yourself and become more self-sufficient, at least for a period of time during these times of crisis. So to begin this analysis, I want to share with you a tool that we've developed that can help you identify the economic relationships that exist within your region. This is information that you would gather about your region, and it includes a number of time-tested survey instruments that you can tailor for your local community that can help you identify your business-to-business linkages, your supply chain links, your resident-to-business relationships. Another advantage of this tool, our community income and expenditures model, and you'll see the link here at the bottom of the slide where these tools are available to you to replicate and tailor to your local community's needs. This helps you to gain ownership in your regional economy by understanding the nature of the relationships within that region, within your region. So essentially, this tool will allow you, if you look at this diagram, using dollars as a way to understand your regional economy. What are the inputs that you get? Where do you sell goods and services to outsiders? These would be areas of vulnerability that in crisis might have supply chain interruptions. And then you see where your dollars are going, where purchases of goods and services are primarily sold to outsiders. These would identify weaknesses in your potential business community who rely on other places for their income streams. Again, a vulnerability that you might be able to address at your regional level. And then also the income and expenditures model allows you to more fully understand what happens within your region in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services through the mobilization of your local resources and of your human talent skills, your labor, your management, your technology, and your capital. So again, this is a simplified example of what a regional economy would look like, where you can identify some of your vulnerabilities. It will give you specific information related to your business to business relationships, your business to households relationships, the relationship that your public sector plays with the private sector and your households. And you can identify, again, where vulnerability might exist that you might be able to strengthen with local import substitution or local supply chains that might supply needed goods and services during a time of a black swan event or other unanticipated hazard. So I want to also draw your attention to some additional materials that are indicated in our bibliography at the end of the slideshow. This is a piece of work done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology that gives guidance to local communities on infrastructure investments. This is very much focused on the built environment and how you can make cost-benefit decisions related to specific investments you might choose to make at the local level in infrastructure to mitigate the negative impacts of a major event. I'd like to draw your attention in particular, this is a very good piece of work and very detailed, to the identifying non-market considerations. The work done by NIST points out that we have issues related to valuing life. How much investment should we make to secure against an event that may occur in the future, and how many lives might that investment save, and how much, what is the value of those lives, such that we can that you're able to make some estimation of the cost benefit analysis of that kind of investment. Now, of course, that varies. I mean, you make the investment, but the event doesn't occur, or you make the investment and it's of a nature that the event is even greater, so it even overwhelms your investment. So you, again, may experience greater loss of life. But again, this tool guides you in a very thoughtful way to make these kinds of cost-benefit analysis for those of you who are involved in allocating the limited resources that our communities have. And let me emphasize that in this material that our colleagues in the National Institute of Standards and Technology have developed, they emphasize over and over again the importance of broad community participation in this conversation, both in terms of making the kind of informed decisions you need to make in terms of the allocation of resources, but also in setting the priorities for what actions you will or what actions you may not take. So in summary, let me summarize a few key things that I want to help communicate to you. That our traditional planning and economic development forecasting tools are likely to have limited relevance in a post-COVID 21st century world, where we're likely to see more unanticipated hazards and events confront us. So again, our reliance on the past to forecast the future has limits. Not all voices are heard in a virtual world. We need to be extremely cautious in relying on a virtual system to make decisions and informing the public. We know that some communities don't have access to the necessary equipment to be fully participating in the 21st century, nor do all businesses. And we know that even individuals may not have the skills and materials to do that. And one of the challenges I would suggest in the 21st century is to make sure that we overcome this limited access to the virtual world. Many of our communities are likely to see an allocation of resources out of the American Recovery Act that has just been recently passed by the Congress. Let me suggest that you take a lesson from our COVID experience and use that allocation to address the weaknesses that we have seen as a result of this. So ensuring that people and places in our state have full access to this and other resources necessary to secure their health and happiness. The racial inequality that we've seen highlighted and income inequality that's been highlighted by this COVID virus is also something that, again, I hope you will seriously consider utilizing whatever resources may be made available to you in response to COVID to address. I would encourage communities to think seriously about, let's not just pick up our to-do list and fund those projects, but to think about those projects that are most critical, that have been revealed to us through this COVID experience, that help us prepare for future challenges that we're likely to face. So think of it as what we might call a COVID dividend. You know, let's not think about going back, think about going forward. How do we create a more socially just and environmentally sustainable world, and utilizing and learn from this opportunity that we are experiencing, so that we have a better and safer future for ourselves and our posterity. I encourage you to think about this. Think about the 500,000 Americans whose lives have been lost as a result of this COVID experience. That's more than twice the number of folks that we lost in World War II. We should learn from this and honor their sacrifice and change where we can to create a more just and sustainable future for our communities and our local economies. Think about how in your region you are meeting your social foundational needs, and think about how you are also addressing your ecological ceiling and minimizing the negative effects. We've been discussing the possibility of advancing what we call a CCED plus scenario, a comprehensive economic development strategy that would incorporate the not only the economic characteristic, but also the social and ecological ceilings that challenge us to be successful in the future. And I hope that you will be a part of bringing about this possible change. So in closing, let me remind you that Charles Darwin did not tell us it was the strongest nor the most intelligent that would survive. It was those species that were most responsive to change. Our capacity to change when confronted with severe challenges is a test of our capacity to survive. And I hope that we can respond to this in a positive way that honors those that we've lost during this tragedy and builds that more sustainably just and socially just and environmentally sustainable world. So again, I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Emma Gilbert, and my MSU colleagues that have pulled this together. And I hope that you will find this material helpful. We have a suggested reading list, which we believe would be helpful to you in your work in trying to create that regionally resilient economy. And with that, I thank you for this opportunity.
Development problem, and what is the current issues of government response. And he proposed a different approach, which is basically making it having a sustainable economic base. By doing that, he first looked at the advantages and the disadvantage of inner city locations. So here are listed above advantages versus disadvantages. And then he proposed the new roles for private sector, government, and community-based organizations centered around creating this sustainable business sector for the inner city. I'm giving you this example just to showcase that similar analysis could be conducted for each region or each municipality, each county, to really have a clear understanding and then about your competitive advantage versus disadvantage, then perhaps integrated with your new economic development plan. Now let's switch gear to the most significant stressors for our current world, which is climate change and pandemic. And they are also quite intertwined. As Dr. Fauci claimed, that we have entered a pandemic era. So even though COVID-19 we may actually finally get into the stage that control the situation and may finally perhaps get out this year or next year, but however, we should expect that we may have more pandemics coming on the way in future. And climate change actually, from different angle, has facilitated the pandemic spreading for the rest of this century. With this, climate change is actually our biggest challenge in this century. This is the WMO's climate risk extreme event and the related impacts charts to looking at how much our world has been affected by climate change directly. And Rex also mentioned the adaptation, resilient cities, and adaptation and mitigation are two important strategies which categorize their adaptation is basically, assuming the risk is there, how do you actually deal with it and decrease your exposure? And mitigation is from a long term, how do we actually avoid this kind of the climate change to happen? One is very short term or mid term, the other is long term oriented. The elements of resilience, Rex also mentioned, enhancing a community resilience, we have to improve its capacity to anticipate and the multi-hazard threats and reduce the overall vulnerability and respond and recover from specific hazard events when they occur. So the resilient cities, the climate change impact assessment and climate vulnerability maps should be developed. And then you can develop the adaptation and mitigation strategies and initiatives focusing on infrastructure, property, avoid property damage and human health and many other issues. Urban integrated assessment for climate resilience should be developed to looking at different climate change scenarios in conjunction with your urban development scenarios, looking at your development plans and policies, and then come out with a concrete implementation plan. So all the consideration of climate change should put into the mainstream development plans, such as master plan, open space plan, and long-term sustainable development plans, looking at environmental restoration, ecosystem services. So with economic development in the post or the pandemic era, the two major trends will remain even after the pandemic. One is growing physical distance. The other is online everything from work, school, shopping, entertainment, and social interactions. Even though some of the physical activity will be recovered, however, we should expect that there's a significant increase of online component for all these categories of activities. So for instance, this is the news about Michigan's economy could be permanently changed by COVID-19, which basically showing you that business travel will be reduced and demand for office space suppressed. The traditional brick and mortar retail shopping will be shifted more towards online shopping, and this pace will be accelerated. And the biggest industry of our state, auto industry, has been impacted heavily. National auto sale projected dropped 15% in 2020, and the big three projected drop 17% in 2020. So with this big impact, I would like to present you a case research that I've done looking at Michigan communities of online market space and Main Street integration, which is conducted before the pandemic era. But as I mentioned before, now it actually seems more relevant to our current strategies to be a resilient economy. So the context is overall decreasing or decline of the retailer, American retailer giants such as Sears, Macy's, and Junkers. However, the rise of the electronic commerce superstars such as Amazon and eBay. And the other strategy is called the click and mortar, which is basically combining online market place with Main Street, referring to the physical built environment, but also not exclusive to downtown areas. And this is being considered as a local proactive strategy. The benefits included cost saving, improved differentiation, enhanced trust, and market extension. So here are the basic research questions to look at the overall situation of local business integration with e-commerce, e-commerce with physical marketplace, and what are the key drivers and barriers. Here are the 3 selected communities located at Middle Michigan: Old Town of Lansing, Downtown East Lansing, as well as Okemos Jolly intersection commercial area, a typical suburban commercial community. So here is the situation of Old Town of City Lansing. Perhaps many of you have been familiar with. Basically, the Old Town of East Lansing, Downtown Lansing, has been affected by suburbanization and caused a decline in the late 20th century. The vacancy rate was as high as 90% in the 1990s. Now it's smaller than 10%. And downtown East Lansing had a major shift in terms of building really mixed use redevelopment project in downtown East Lansing. As you may have seen, the high rises. And the commercial area in Meridian Township, as you can see from this graph, it's quite typical suburban suburban community commercial area. And here are the interviews, and let me directly jump into the findings. First of all, looking at national level, the e-commerce and percentage of e-commerce revenue. The nationally e-commerce has increased significantly in the last 2 decades and has become a key sector in the US economy, particularly in manufacturing sectors, in certain subsectors of manufacturing sector, and also wholesale trade sector. And in terms of a service sector, travel arrangement, air transportation, and other information services, and also retail trade sector, non-store retailers, especially electronic shopping and mail order houses has increased significantly. Remember, this is the data before pandemic era. And looking at the 3 cases, the e-commerce impact are very different. The Old Town, Downtown Lansing, and Downtown Lansing, they had a decline of Main Street commerce due to the suburbanization in later half of 20th century. However, they already adapted their structure and the composition of commercial area. E-commerce actually contribute to a comeback when local-oriented and experienced business are set up. So it's really focusing on the experience-based business rather than product-oriented business. Meridian Township, overall affected by e-commerce due to a regional shopping mall. However, its suburban commercial area is not particularly affected. Business are really focusing on specialty products and services for local suburban communities. So overall, the economic development and plan and e-commerce, the planners have an optimistic view. Lansing considers itself a comeback location for urban business and residents. And East Lansing experienced the most conspicuous physical landscape change in its downtown area. Meridian Township has challenges of closing of several anchor stores. However, they are pursuing a change from product-based to experienced services for commercial areas. Future economic planning, all 3 communities are very clear about their relative position in the capital region and have plans for their own centers and sub-centers. I'm not going to go to detail, but looking at the particularly the e-commerce adoption. So for the e-commerce adoption, the findings are there are no direct assistance in technology support for e-commerce to small business due to the limited capacity. However, the indirect supports are there in various kinds, which are very important for small businesses. For instance, for the Lansing Old Town small businesses, they actually have close relationship with City of Akron in Ohio, worked with a retail revival program, a 12-month eBay pilot program, by helping providing the technology power and global online market space to small businesses. And the program identifies small businesses that are interested in utilizing workable website for e-commerce. For East Lansing and Meridian Township, city officials have helped the business finding suitable locations, and the direct business to other organizations, such as Michigan Small Business Development Center. They are really very helpful for technological assistance for business plan formation. So in terms of status, the online business, not a significant portion of interviewed business, except an accommodation business. Again, I want to emphasize this is before the pandemic era. There's about 20% for one retail trade business, and then less than 1% of a specialty merchandise business. This is a range of online business. And the extent of e-commerce adoption is also differentiated by age group of most local customers. All the businesses have online presentation there. And however, some business interact with customer to order and pay online, and other business intentionally not using online payment. And some business have online platform for supply management. So there is adoption ladder model seems to be able to describe this. However, there's also another model called publicize, interact, and transform model. It's basically you see this, the degree of adaptation of e-commerce has, first of all, publish and publicize information on website, which is ubiquitous. Then interact with customers and suppliers is a little bit challenging for some of the business. And finally, to transform the way the business undertake its activities, that's the most advanced degree for local business. So for the click and mortar integration, the physical presence of local stores has been viewed important, even though the online business is not because the online business is not a significant percentage of transaction. However, it's unimaginable not to have online presence. And websites, social media has been effective attract new customers and outside of the, within and outside of the region, as well as maintaining the interest of existing customer bases. There's also market extension implication, especially business of specialty boutique and special local products. In terms of technology resources, major barrier do not have, is basically technology core staff do not have a dedicated IT technologist. And usually they sign up IT services subscription by paying an annual fee. Many ask friends or neighbors for assistance. So the support from public sector has not been expected as resources are especially limited. To overcome this barrier, as I mentioned before, there's examples of other programs such as eBay's Revival Main Street program, and also other companies like delivery companies advocate mobile phone apps for food delivery. And there's also technological assistance as a group collectively to the small business. And their organizations such as Michigan Small Business Development Center are very helpful. Finally, headquarters of franchise company have been considered very helpful. Physical and social environment are very important, even though not directly related to e-commerce. The physical environment, some of the business owner mentioned, access to easy parking is always a concern, and the leniency towards small business in terms of building environmental regulation, sidewalk signs, and flower bed decoration, etc. And then interactive social environments are particularly needed for small business. The small the different communities, they have different degrees of social business network. Old Town has been particularly good in, strong in this aspect. So local governments and planners may specifically targeting locally owned business for social network and community engagement. And so the conclusion is there's different impacts for e-commerce. Support for e-commerce may focus on, not directly technical assistance, however, through indirect support via different organizations. And finally, the benefits, there's a benefit of integration of online market and physical stores. The main enabler of e-commerce adoption is easy accessibility to technology and resources, particularly for small local businesses. So with this case, I want to go back to the resilient economy plan under climate change and the pandemics. So the role of local economic planners, looking at the click model integration, what role should local economic planners play? Business consultant or technology enabler? If technology enabler is not possible because of limited capacity, maybe act as a broker to link different programs that can provide technology assistance to businesses. And another thought is setting online social environment. If physical social environment has been particularly difficult in the pandemic or post-pandemic era. And we also have to think about who will thrive online, who suffers, consider about inclusiveness. Best practice examples from other places may be good to reference. And the other thing that I want to refer back is the COVID dividend or the donut economics paradigm that Rex has mentioned in the previous presentation. Finally, the priority setting on the climate change and the pandemic. The anticipation, climate change adaptation, we have to be creative to, in terms of restructuring the economy for the resilience, nature-based solution, looking at the environment assets for adaptation, mitigation, as well as for economic development. In terms of the investment, looking at the sectors and areas and population, priority really should be set. Finally, the infrastructure matters, especially electricity, telecom, and transportation infrastructure. One good example is a recent Texas, electricity shutdown due to their not anticipating in terms of the extreme climate event. That it's really providing us a very good lesson to learn. And other, telecom infrastructure, the online infrastructure is really very critical for the pandemic or post-pandemic era for all the community. With that, I will finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fan. That was a great look, taking some of those theoretical concepts that we heard and applying them in a research study. And I saw some awesome questions come in that we will get to at the end of all of our panelists. So if you do have those questions, remember to throw them into the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff Smith to take us a little bit deeper into how this actually plays out on the ground in his career. Jeff?
Excellent, thank you. Can you share, or can you see my shared presentation? Just making sure.
Yep, we got a full screen of slide and hearing you loud and clear.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Extremely important and pertinent information provided by both Dr. Lamore and Dr. Fan. I'll be kind of taking the theories and the programmatic and analysis information that they talked about and kind of identifying how I've applied it to my career over the last 15 years. So it'll be a more of a practical economic resiliency discussion. So hopefully you have questions, and please throw those in the Q&A section at the bottom, and we'll get to them at the end. So I'm Jeff Smith. I'm the director of the University Corporate Research Park at the MSU Foundation. I've had kind of a bounce around career that has pushed me forward at every step, and I'll get into those in just a second. So I started off my career with an organization called AT&T Broadband Network Solutions. I was doing both network engineering and market analysis for AT&T, identifying which markets in the United States they should roll out high-speed fiber back in 1998, 1999. It was the first implementation, some of the first implementation of the cable modem and first direct line internet that was high speed. So what they were doing is identifying each market in the United States using a very rudimentary GIS application at the time, but it was really drilling into the creative and competitive strengths and weaknesses of the community, each community of a certain population everywhere in the US. And so I learned very quickly to do competitive and comparative advantages of a community. And that basic understanding of economic highs and lows for a community really allowed me to push myself into a much more analytical frame of mind for how I was going to approach my career. So I loved the market analysis a great deal and tried to find a new path instead of I graduated with a degree in telecommunications from Michigan State. I wanted to do more than design networks and fix network connections. My goal was to create this pathway for myself that would allow me to help apply what I was learning to the community I was living in, time Greater Lansing. So I got the great fortune of transitioning to an organization called Anderson Economic Group. There I learned to do quite a bit of analysis for each community we were working with. We were hired to go into communities all over the US and do the economic resiliency test for those communities and help them identify a framework and a strategy forward that would help them to grow in a way that was sustainable. So we did things like Dr. Fan mentioned, location quotient analysis, supply demand analysis, lifestyle and tapestry demographic data analysis, and natural resource inventories, identifying what unique natural characteristics a community possessed that would put them in a different category than others. Communities like Boise, Idaho, that are exploding right now, may not have had the ability or the understanding that they needed to exploit those natural features and the affordable living conditions that they had to attract the kind of population influx that they're seeing now during the pandemic, where people are very mobile. So I took all of that analysis with me as I started to transition, as I mentioned, to doing that for a community I was living in. And I was able to do a study while I was at Anderson Economic Group that applied directly to some to-do lists for the city of East Lansing, and was able to actually transition from AEG to the city as an economic development administrator for the city, and apply all those to-dos and the analysis that we had done over the years in that community. And so what we found was, hold on one second, it's transitioning. There it goes. What we found was that what are the key characteristics that a community has? And I think there was a mention in the chat window about, can we look at the best practices of different communities and put them in kind of a matrix and identify where the total list is, and then go out and apply those same tools and techniques? We did that same thing in the city of East Lansing. There were a lot of things going for it. There's not a lot of communities that have a Division I university sitting in their backyard. The nightlife at the time and the activity and the amount of concentrated retail and the turnover, all of those things were things that were positive for the community, but there were an awful lot of things that were missing. And so we did a gap analysis, and what we found was that there was things like the economic seasonality of East Lansing. How do you inject more activity during those off months when students aren't around. And so we started looking at everything from that to the transportation network, to the linkages on the river trail, to, how does a community like East Lansing really showcase its economic strengths? What are its economic strengths beyond the university? And I'll get to the tools that we used in just a minute. So transitioning from the city, we did that same thing, and I did that same thing at the regional level and went to work for the Regional Economic Development Agency here called LEAP as the Director of New Economy Initiatives. My goal there, take those same analytical approaches and apply them to the region. And what we really focused on is community development, community investment, and economic gardening. How do we find the lowest common denominator between all the residents, regardless of who, what, where, and when, and allow all of those individuals to participate in the economic benefits and growth of the region? Didn't matter whether it was Potterville or Holt. It was really, what were the strengths and how do we create an opportunity for everybody to get involved? So what we found was, again, that there was a growing number of people graduating out of MSU and LCC and some other universities and colleges that had these fashion and textile design certificates or degrees in their hand, but didn't have a platform for really testing those ideas out. And so a lot of those individuals were leaving the market. After a lot of testing and pursuing and persuading, we ended up launching the Runway Fashion Incubator. It was a great success. We partnered with LCC. We ended up having a lot of resources available to local designers and retailers of fashion. And the program made a rather significant splash. Later in that next year, we launched something called Lansing Maker Week to showcase all the activities that were happening, not just in the manufacturing industry, but beyond, because the greater Lansing community tends to have an inordinate amount of people who tinker, who make, and that includes everything from brewing beer to making furniture. That spectrum of making things really needed to be showcased. And so we spent a very long time showcasing and building up this crescendo of time to really launch this Lansing Maker Week that ended up getting the attention of the White House, and we were listed as a model program for communities to really identify what their economic strengths were at the time. So taking those same approaches, how, community development, community investment, economic gardening, starting to drill into, okay, what can we do to get, if we're looking at it from the gap analysis perspective, what can we do to get people to participate in the community development side of things? So we launched, an adventure race in town. We created a platform for people to get up and talk about anything from, anything that they wanted to talk about for 5 minutes, a Pechakucha style event. It was very entrepreneurial in nature, but it also rewarded failure. So anyone that wanted to talk about something that led to an end result that was kind of life-changing or a learning lesson, anything but politics and religion were allowed to be presented. And so there was a very curated, very awesome, very connected event that also showcased spaces around Greater Lansing that people might not be aware of. And same with the adventure race. The 6 to 8 hours of getting around the Greater Lansing area in areas that people had very rarely, if ever, been to really illustrate and demonstrate what was going on in the community. The Red Paddle event, there were an awful lot of people that would hesitate to get on the Red Cedar or the Grand River due to preconceived notions or misconceptions or even real notions of health and safety. It allowed us to activate that resource and that amenity and that asset for the area to allow more and more people to get on the river to help even clean it up, to get it to where it became a real asset again. And then using the spaces and places and the connections like the Lansing River Trail to be an advocate and to say, we need more money spent in these areas. We need maintenance and safety to be improved. We need to scale this and include everybody that we can include, because the river trail doesn't care who you are. The river doesn't care who you are. The stage doesn't care who you are. We want you to have an opportunity to connect. And that ability to connect helps drive the economy for everybody. And that was kind of the approach we were taking from the community development stand. We continue to look at, okay, and build off of, lessons learned from previous events. We started looking at how do we make those adventure race and those connections to spaces and places that are unique to our area available on a 24-hour basis. We launched a scavenger hunt app called Pointy. It's downloadable on Android right now. That's not a plug, that's a reality. It was a way for any community in the United States to do the same thing that we were talking about, or even in the world. So if you wanted to leak breadcrumbs for the person that wants to participate in something that's similar to what you're doing, you can create that platform, create those points of interest, and allow those people to participate in a way that's creative and fun. Zipcar, connecting people, and this was back in 2009, 2010, connecting people to the resources, places, and spaces that may not have transportation options, and that maybe not connected to a bus route, or for whatever reason it might be, getting the transportation connectivity in place. We also launched a car sharing or a bike sharing program when we were at the city of East Lansing to allow all the employees and volunteers and community members of the city of East Lansing to grab a bike. So we worked with the bike sharing program or the bike renewal program called Share a Bike. We took some old bikes that weren't being bought, but were still in good use, put them into a rotation, set them up on a calendar, and people could check them out and make them available. And they were just, available around the greater East Lansing area. We launched a startup weekend in this market, and it's been ongoing since 2007, 2008. It's the longest running and most active startup weekend event in the United States. We have created a platform, we created a platform and worked with the startup weekend folks at Techstars to allow people to launch a business in 54 hours. Ideas are pitched. It happens twice a year. It still happens right now. Ideas are pitched, and you have 54 hours to launch a company. You have a team, you have resources, and you have a group of people that are very interested in getting that going. It's like a 5K for entrepreneurs, but it's really about getting those ideas to the marketplace. Lansing 501, it's a program that's an offshoot of a nonprofit that was started as part of all the Dirty Feet and Red Paddle and activities that were happening along then. But Lansing 501 is to showcase and connect and scale all those things that are happening in the community to those that are looking to stay in this community. So, the gardens that are around town and the businesses that are around town that we don't necessarily have an opportunity to highlight all the time. Lansing 501 is a way to connect those that are maybe interning in the market, that are from another market, and showcase what's happening here so that maybe those individuals, when they're considering whether or not to stay or go, they consider to stay. Community investment. So when we look at opportunities for people to actually participate, sometimes it's financial. It may not be $50,000. It may be $500. Trying to find a way for those micro lending opportunities and lowest common denominator connectivities to occur. Entrepreneur Institute of Mid-Michigan recently transitioned to the Michigan Women's Foundation, but leading up to that, it was the CDFI or Community Development Finance Institution. It was the micro lending. It was the SBA lender. It was the educator for those that didn't necessarily have the ability to connect at a higher level. It was a way for them to connect at a common level that allowed the rising tide to raise all ships. Pure Venture Partners was one of the first and only venture capital organizations in the greater Lansing area for quite some time until Red Cedar came along. Altruist Capital was to take, just like it sounds, altruistic investments into ideas that were starting to come out of programs like the Hatching, where you have 5 minutes to present a business idea. You receive funding in cash at the end of that presentation if it's if the judges agree that it's a good enough idea. Altruist was to follow on with that and to provide some seed funding to keep that idea moving forward. these things help kind of propel the bottom part of the economy that really was missing for many years in the greater Lansing area, just giving it some foundation to stand on so that those early stage companies can turn into mid-stage companies, can start filling Class B space in the market, and can start to really expand that way. Economic development, taking the ideas that were coming out of all those pipelines and giving them a home to actually grow and to actually provide resources around them to accelerate them faster. Incubation space, acceleration space. We launched the East Lansing Technology Innovation Center in 2008 as a way to take those ideas that were starting to really materialize, give them a home, if they were grant funded federally, or if they were invested in locally, or if they were self-funded in grassroots. It allowed those companies to then have, a conference room to connect, a mailing address to actually receive their mail, a way to collide with other entrepreneurs. And that's incredibly important. The collisions are incredibly important, whether they're, manifested or they're proactive connections or they're reactive connections, or if they're contrived. Like we set up situations where coffee and cocktails are available, and we intentionally get these entrepreneurs to connect with each other, because you never know where that next innovation is going to come from. So those results were, featuring the East Lansing Tech was featured as a top 10, an asset of a top 10 college town to start a business in East Lansing. It's a financially sustainable model. So, for the life of its lease, it has balanced the revenue and expenses. We have events in there currently. It's a little different now, but we're still operating as best we can in a pandemic environment. The Hatch, the student run, for the most part, program at MSU. This is a Burgess Institute program now, but it was actually launched by a group of students years ago for students that are undergrad or grad to test out a business idea. It's been, an incredibly successful program. The Burgess Institute won the Global Consortium of Entrepreneurial Centers, GCEC, 2 times in a row. It is now an asset and a kind of a jewel in the crown of the Princeton Review's top 15 universities of entrepreneurial education in the United States. It's really, those things don't start out that way, right? They crescendo to that, but it's identifying at its core what was missing in the economy and then trying to provide it. It's not always a mountain range. It really relies and revolves around people. So again, economic development, we looked at what else is missing in the marketplace. What we found was that there weren't a lot of lab spaces in the market that were available and occupiable by early stage companies. In fact, there were incredibly limited amount of spaces. However, the supply coming from the university and the colleges and from the industry was producing technology transfer and spin out companies at a regular clip. So those companies were moving out of our market altogether in order to find those resources to help them grow. So we launched Van Camp about 1.5 years ago. It was 100% occupied within 8 months. We have about 15 life science and bioscience companies that are in there right now. There's also defense contractors that are operating out of there, out of national defense industry. It ties directly into research commercialization at Michigan State. There's a river trail connection that's already in place that'll take residents or occupants and those that are volunteering or any individual at Michigan State or beyond in the Meridian Township area that wants to connect to that can easily connect to that. Right down the street is Ellison Brewery. There's resources that are starting to compound, and that 1 and 1 equals 3 approach for economic sustainability is really starting to happen in those locations. I apologize, I'm talking fast. I'm trying to get through all of this so that we leave room for questions and answers at the end. Lastly, the research park, which we have managed for quite some time. At one point or another, the city was actually considering, it's in the city of Lansing, the economic development approach at the time was maybe recruit an Applebee's. It was not what we had envisioned for that space. So after a couple of years of recruiting and negotiating and hammering out partnerships, the McLaren Health Wellness Center is going to be opening up in 2022. It's a $600 million hospital that is just to the south of campus. It's in the city of Lansing. Again, connectivity to the River Trail system and campus across the street from the U Club, Henry Center, and Candlewood Suites. So there's already resources in place for a lot of that activity and connectivity to happen. You may have read in the paper, for some of you who are in the local market, that there's a traffic circle happening and getting added to the Collins and Forest Road intersection. Those road and highway infrastructure improvements are happening for both pedestrian and vehicle access, but it's the, using that same approach. What is already there? What can we do to improve it? And how do we add layers here that connects everyone and allows everybody to participate? And then, so that will be opening up in 2022. But if we hadn't looked at this from a lens, and I'd be very remiss if I didn't mention it, if we hadn't looked at this from a lens early on of analysis, we wouldn't be where we're at today. We used things from Tri-County. We used the CCED's priority projects to secure infrastructure funding in 2008 and 2009 in the research park that allowed us to save a great deal of funds on road improvements, sewer and water and fiber improvements in the research park to help attract the hospital. We used the CCED's initial analysis for knowledge-based economy index for us to build out the Technology Innovation Center and know what companies to recruit. That's a location quotient analysis, identifying which industries would be the best industries to grow based off of import, export, your shift share analysis, and what your overall potential of growth would be your economic base. And then continue to apply results and evaluate best practices. We looked at, and I'm a part of Redevelopment Ready Communities advisory group for the MEDC. It's taking those same practical approaches and analytical approaches for a community and applying it statewide, trying to identify how do we grow those small communities or large communities in a way that's redevelopment ready and sustainable from an economic standpoint. I think that's it. My contact information's on the slide, and thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for taking us to that on-the-ground look and sharing some of your career history with us. And we're going to move into the question and answer portion here. But before we do, I, of course, have some thank yous. We'd just like to thank our Session 2 partners, the Comprehensive Economic Recovery Initiative, the U.S. Economic Development Administration, the MSU School for Planning, Design, and Construction, the MSU Foundation, and the University Research Park that you just heard about, the National Charrette Institute here at MSU, and the Urban Collaborators Program. And just a reminder to all of our participants out there, we have gotten some rolling in, but there is that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. That's going to be the best way to submit a question for one or all of our presenters here as we move into the more discussion point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. And to kick it off, we had more of a logistics question asking if the reading list could be sent out to participants so that they could do that homework I had mentioned. And yes, Harmony has said that she will copy that over and include it in the follow-up email that will also have the link to our recording when that gets sent out. So look forward to that. And first question, somebody was asking how to identify best practices to help businesses modernize those e-commerce opportunities. That idea of not reinventing the wheel. Do our panelists know of places like that that are compiling those, or know of folks who are interested in developing that list of proven approaches and perhaps funding opportunities for that?
Rex, do you want to talk about REI and maybe the opportunities there?
I was thinking Pele is probably the best one to answer this because of her familiarity with the e-commerce scenario.
Well, I have some research and read a lot about like big ones like Amazon, But I think here we are concerned about small business, perhaps. I think this is really like a lack of area that has been researched well in this sense. So I'm looking at the CCED if you could actually provide some opportunities for people to look at it in this area, especially focusing on, small business in Michigan communities.
It's possible. I think the Quello Center at MSU might be another support for you. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question fully as I heard it. It was, what are the funding sources, or what are the best practices to getting e-commerce on Main Street? And so I think that might be best addressed through doing your own homework and finding where you see good models that relate to your Main Street. And then as far as funding that kind of work, MEDC does make some funding available to help support e-commerce activities at the local level. So I think that's the question they're asking, maybe.
I think that starts to get at it. And yeah, just knowing that this is out there and maybe some groups can form collaboratives and work on this out of this presentation. So, thanks. We had another one that's kind of a broad question here, but what sort of conceptual lenses might our panelists use to check whether different approaches are more or less sustainable? Do you have any frameworks or lenses that you typically use when answering that question of, is this sustainable, if I can speak?
Historic. Does it work over a period of time?
Right. Has it been working? Will it continue? Yeah.
The question is really, I'd make a note that sustainability is actually an unnatural act. Nature sustains nothing. Everything comes and goes. So the idea of sustaining is really, how do we preserve the current human environment in the way it is now? Probably not able to do that. We're going to have to make changes.
And then the other thing is about sustainable is really looking at under the big stressors like climate change and then big changer of the world like pandemic or possibly change caused by the post-pandemic era, whether or not you have anticipated and fully integrated into your future plan for development. I think one of the slides I mentioned, like, what are the procedures you could incorporate it into incorporating, climate change scenarios into your different development plans. So that's another way to get prepared and proactive to deal with the unforeseen change in future. That's another way to think about sustainability, I think.
Thank you. Then we had a question for Jeff and Pele. Could you elaborate a little bit on the role of social affinity in the economic development projects and research? Our participant thinks that it's a challenge in their region and curious how to maybe address that. Any thoughts there?
I can definitely speak to it. So it's a challenge everywhere, and some of it is by nature. So where there are only a certain amount of people aware from a marketing standpoint, the communications only hit certain channels because you're naturally only pushing it out in certain ways. The recipients may not be actually receiving the information in a equitable way. The other part is, we're not doing a good enough job connecting the dots. I think you have to see yourself in a project or program in order for you to participate. In order for you to feel like this is for me, the program needs to be inclusive in a way that allows the end user to feel like it's for them. When we looked at when we rolled out the hatching event, we tried to pick a location that made a lot of sense from public standpoint. The social affinity part was anybody can attend it. It was centrally located. It was walkable. It was bus routable. But we didn't do a good job of broadening the net and casting it, the messaging out. We didn't do a good enough job. What we found was it was word of mouth that ended up being the best connector. Starting to spread your loops and having social conversations and including, everyone, even if you didn't think that they'd be interested in the topic, that person might share with somebody in their office, it might share with somebody at their house, might share with somebody at their school. And you start to build this network just by word of mouth. The Fledge in Lansing is a great example of a very grassroots, word of mouth, starting to beat the drum type of socially connected program. It's not glamorous, it's not intended to be, but it is certainly incredibly connected from a social network standpoint up and down the ladder. Everybody feels at home at the Fledge, and it was heavily connected and communicated and marketed through grassroots efforts and word of mouth.
Yeah, I would follow up with Jeff on the importance of social environment. From the cases of 3 communities, like Old Town definitely have the highest level of social business network, but it's also depend on the type of a business. Okay, but then basically the Old Town has the highest level of social business network. They actually have regular meeting, like I think one of the Friday every month for 1 hour for everybody who is interested, business owners to get together. And many informal relationships has been established, like, even some business opportunity has been introduced by words of mouth. So it's really important, and people get comfortable gradually and get involved and feel they belong to this community. And then, for instance, East Lansing, it's another situation. It's long-term business. They're very involved. However, small business level of interest is not the same level. And then due to the constraint of their resources and time resources and other resources. For Meridian Township, small business, they express hopes of building similar social networks as those of in Old Town. However, it seems very difficult to achieve because the national chain stores with business managers that are not locally tied. So it's really on type of the business, national chain or small local independent, or is it like long-term business or small type of a business. And I think one thing that I don't know what is exactly in the planners point of mind at this stage, because now physical gathering is not possible. But perhaps an online social gathering or a sort of like integration of both physical and social and online gathering for community business owners could be something that can be considered for a strategy to build this identity, community identity for business owners.
Thank you. And just want to note for our participants, it looks like the panelists are being superstars and typing in some questions to the Q&A. So be sure to open up that Q&A box to see if there are typed answers there. And with a little bit of time we got left, it wouldn't really be a day in the pandemic if I didn't get to say new normal. So how might the new normal of people working from home, at least part-time more, change opportunities for local resiliency?
I can answer a little bit of a new normal for us. So we operate about 300,000 square foot of space, lots of programs, and in a variety of uses. And for us, we found vacancy in office to be increasing significantly. I think there was a question about vacancies increasing at Meridian and Lansing Mall. What do you do there? You start to identify, taking the brick and mortar shell of a space and put it into some really creative ways, putting it back into use. You also take your outdoor space as much as possible and put it into creative use. If the requirement and the safety approach is to be outside, to socially distance, and to put safety as number one, you can still connect with each other. The collisions are still just as important today as they were, a year and a half ago. You can still connect with one another and each other, both virtually and in person. And I think Pele's mentioning of the hybrid model of this kind of retail brick and mortar versus the e-commerce the e-commerce solution. These hybrid approaches to space and place are where the new normal are heading, and providing resources that you can't Amazon, right? I can't Amazon a haircut. I can't Amazon a coffee cup in my hand. I can't Amazon certain things, and finding ways to connect people to those places that they still want interaction is where things are heading, and probably where things should have been anyway. The question about, is this a question of adaptability or sustainability? It's a little bit of both. It is, you're adapting to sustain your economy. Rex's point about nature's a brutal force. It doesn't want us to be here. We have to adapt in order to stay. And that's how economies have to look at themselves as well. There's plenty of spaces that are going through their second or third or fourth iteration of what it's going to be used for. Being creative enough to look at it and being willing to open up the conversation, open it up to a public comment and get as much input as you can. What could we use this space or place for if it isn't this today?
Well, thank you. And I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I know there's a lot more questions we didn't get a chance to get to. I apologize for that, but wanted to leave a little space at the end for any final thoughts from our panelists.
I just would like to reiterate that I think we have an outstanding obligation to work to make the future different than the past, and that returning to the normalcy is probably not the direction. We don't want to go backwards, we want to go forwards. And I think we try to learn from the experiences that we've had over the last 13 months and really try to create that more just, socially just and environmentally sustainable future that I think we're all striving for. So that would be my final thoughts.
I would like to reiterate the importance of product-based towards the experience-based business focus for the retailing business, particularly that's relevant in this era.
All right, well, I have 10 o'clock, so I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, asking great questions and being active participants in this. And thank you for taking this back to your communities and beginning to find the ways that it can work there. Here at Extension, we are, of course, all about the application. And a reminder that next week we will have session 3 looking at the intersections of climate adaptation, economic health, and public health. Registration is still open, so share that link. Get some more people here if they are interested in climate adaptation and health. And with that, we will see you all hopefully next Wednesday. Thank you again to all of our panelists and sponsors. It was a great session.